Right. Welcome, Edwin, to Yoga Chats on Keen on Yoga. So this is going to be notions of Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras. We've just discussed this. We might go on to the Gita if we have time, everyone. So listen carefully. Right, Edwin, off you go. No, I don't mean that. So no, I read the sutras as quite a kind of psychological text, really. It seems to just be about unpicking the corruption or obstacles in mind for the mind to see clearly. It doesn't seem to be that devotive over, now and again you get little bits Ishvara Pranidhana var or a couple of little insertations. How much of Ishvara is there in there?
Yeah, great question. I would actually think of yoga more as, in terms of yoga clearing the mind, that's true. The mind has to become aklishta, but remember the grand finale goal of yoga is to still the mind completely and go and experience a state of pure consciousness beyond the mind. So I think if we're looking for practices that clear the mind and allow us to see clearly, meaning the mind seeing clearly, then the Gita, that would be something the Gita is much more interested in, because the Gita is more interested in action in the world. And if you act in the world, you need to use your mind. So ideally, you would use a pure mind. So the seeing in the Yoga Sutras is the seeing itself. Drashtu swarupe vastanam. So at that point, the mind, obviously it has to see clearly in order to understand that, what the goal of life is. The mind has to see clearly in order to understand that it's suffering.
Yeah.
Have to see clearly in order to understand that it itself is the cause of suffering. It's kleshas within it, ignorance and desires and so forth. So of course, it has to see clearly, in order to take up the practice. But with the ultimate act of clarity of the mind in yoga is to remove itself. And it realizes, look, I'm actually, I'm a parasite. I'm a parasitic overlay. And, and as long as I'm active, the consciousness of Purusha is absorbed in me, the mind. The mind has to reason, this is viveka, this is insight, this is the sort of highest, this is the highest thing the mind can do, is realize Purusha there's something beyond me. I'm parasitically, absorbing the consciousness of Purusha. And for the Purusha to be actually happy, it's very odd. It's a very odd way of sort of framing. That's what it is. I need to remove myself. So the mind is deconstructing itself. And that's the ultimate act of clarity. I know you want to talk about Ishvara. I just want to throw that out. So, but it's not unrelated, because
not at all. Yeah. I mean, but what remains? Does the separate? I mean, my particular question with it is: okay, the mind is out of the way. Is it just Ishvara that we're absorbing in, or is there still a separate Purusha, many little Purushas and one big Ishvara? Because it says, there's another point where it says, like the Ishvara is a separate Purusha, like a big daddy Purusha, like a special one, right? Like, so when the mind gets out of the way, but it's still distinct. There's still a distinctive consciousness.
Yeah. The yoga is pluralistic. It's pluralistic insofar as there are innumerable Purushas. This is not Advaita Vedanta, even though, a lot of modern yogis...
People would like to make it such.
Neo is It is not that. It never has been that. In 2000 years before it came to the West, it was not that. Sankhya was very clear about what it was. Advaita Vedanta debates Sankhya, which means yoga, right? So let's not confound the two. But, so what remains when the mind nirodhas itself, and then we'll move into Ishvara, is a plurality of Purushas, each one abiding Svarupe, but that doesn't mean they merge. There's absolutely no sense at all. Sankhya, clearly they're pluralistic. Remember, yoga is Sankhya, and the Sankhya Karikas distinctly says each one is individual, because they all have different karmas. They all have different, and it gives a list of reasons as to why they're a plurality of Purushas, one of which is they all have different experiences. So why do we suppose that after the mind is removed, that somehow or other the individual Purushas will somehow merge into each other or merge into Brahman? That is a Advaita Vedanta position. It's a very minority position in Indian philosophy. We don't realize that because it gets exported onto the high streets and main streets in the East-West bookstores, and it sort of becomes, a sort of form of neo-Vedanta. Neo-Advaita.
Neophyte. Yeah.
Actually, Advaita Vedanta is a subset. All the other 5 schools of Indian philosophy are pluralistic. There are eternal plurality of Purushas, and even Vedanta, the bulk of Vedanta is pluralistic. The Vaishnava traditions, Ramanuja, Madhva, and so forth. So in that sense, it's only Advaita Vedanta and the Shakta traditions that do not, recognize the individuality of the Purusha in the liberated state. They would say it loses that individuality, and for them, that's part of the enlightenment process. So just to make sure that we put everything in, but let's connect this with Ishvara. So amongst that plurality of Purushas, there is one Purusha Vishesha, which we'll talk
distinct.
about now.
Yeah.
Special kind of Purusha, and we'll talk about why it's distinct, but go ahead.
You see me bursting to ask you something.
I
was actually waiting patient this time. But once the karmas have gone and the mind is gone, once the mind is gone, surely the mind is gone because the karmas have gone, and then for the individual ceases to exist and is absorbed. Is there no talk of absorption in the spirit?
Well, the spirit just is. It always was. So the Purusha is eternal. Its nature is eternal, and in Sankhya and Yoga, it's an eternal individual. Its individuality is just part of its essence. So it's if you want to think of the what is the Atman, what is the Purusha? Well, it's Sat. It's eternal. It's Chit. Its very nature is consciousness. Fine.
Yeah.
Sankhya and Yoga. Well, Sankhya and Yoga don't speak of Ananda. They don't necessarily. No. They don't actually. They would just say liberation is freedom from suffering. They don't assign a positive quality of Ananda. Vedanta does that. Vedanta does that in a big way because of the, their Vedanta is all about the Upanishads, and the Brihad speaks about the bliss of the Atman. And so Sat and Chit, and it's an individual. It's an individual. It has it's an anu. It's an anutva. It's an individual. There's no, Sankhya Yoga does not take the view that it merges into some other greater Brahman type all-pervading entity. Right. No, each Purusha is absorbed in its own nature, and they're all simultaneously absorbed in their own nature, and they're all infinite. Right. They're infinite. So you have this rather peculiar situation where you have an infinity of Purushas, all infinite. So they co-penetrate each other. They must do. It would be like having a room with 100 light bulbs. So the light of each light bulb pervades the whole room. So you could say the light merges, but each light bulb is an individual.
It's distinct. Yeah.
Well, we have to reconstruct that. They don't actually go that far. In terms of, they don't speak about the liberated state, but we have to reconstruct what that.
Yeah, I suppose that's when you need the Sanskrit, really. Because I'm looking at something like 145 when it says Samadhi Siddhi Isvara Pranidhanat. So it's that in the translation would be something like the absorption in the spirit, right? But that's taking Samadhi as spirit, right? Whereas
Pranidhana doesn't mean absorption. It means surrender. It means surrender.
Right. Surrender to Samadhi or surrender to spirit. But I suppose that's maybe Ishvara. Ishvara,
yeah. Ishvara Pranidhanat Samadhi Siddhir. From Pranidhanat, ablative case, from the surrender Ishvara to Ishvara, what do you get from that? Samadhi Siddhir. You get the boon of Samadhi. See how things get once they hit our high streets.
Yeah, that's why we're here. That's why we're here, everybody. Admittedly, no Sanskrit scholar right now. So the idea of surrender to, there is surrender to Ishvara quite greatly in the text, right? The points, it is quite devotive. Even in Tabasva Dhyana, Ishvara, Kriya Yoga. It's
but the relationship with Ishvara is functionalistic. It's from the point of view of the more developed bhakti traditions, like the Vaishnava traditions. The goal of Patanjali is not love of God. It's not an eternal relationship with Ishvara. Why do you surrender to Ishvara? Because Ishvara can give you Samadhi. And what is Samadhi? It's Svarupa Vastanam.
Right.
It's experience of your own nature.
Right.
The more developed, what they consider themselves to be pure bhaktas, because they're not asking Ishvara for anything, including give me Samadhi. The Vaishnava traditions, the Krishna traditions would say, no, the goal is surrender to Ishvara and an eternal relationship with Ishvara based out of love. You're not asking Ishvara for moksha. So the Krishna traditions and the Vaishnava traditions, they reject moksha. They don't reject it as a possibility, but they totally accept it as ontologically real. And they accept it as a noble sort of goal, but they're not interested in that. They don't want to be svarupa vastanam. They don't want to spend all eternity absorbed in their own nature. They want to spend all eternity in a relationship with the wondrous, Bhagavan, who has an infinity of forms and infinity of different modalities of relationship, which becomes very theologized in the Krishna traditions, especially, but also the Vishnu traditions. But let's stick with Patanjali. So therefore, the Ishvara pranidha, which means pranidha, to sort of surrender.
Yeah, right.
What you do, the reason, so that's not really bhakti. You're really just surrendering. I mean, Ishvara is more like a prop for the mind.
Yeah.
And tasya vachaka pranavaha japa tadartha bhavanam. So Ishvara comes as pranava, which is Om, and then you fix the mind on Om, and then that's how you nirodha the mind, because you got to fix the mind on something to nirodha it. Yes,
but anything could be a prop then. Why use Ishvara, right? It's kind of like a little bit, kind of disingenuous. Oh, I use God just as a prop rather than devote to God. I mean, if there is a distinct Purusha out there, why wouldn't you bow to that? Why wouldn't there be reveration towards that? Use it for your own self.
I think you got a real point there. This is exactly what the Vaishnavas would say. If there is a real God, why are you just pranidhaning to Ishvara?
Yeah,
just for your own experience?
For the Rupa.
Reject it.
Right.
But and even the Gita says, Krishna says, okay, if you want moksha, I'll give you moksha. I mean, Bhagavan can give anything you want. So let's look at it this way. In the 16th century theologies that really they get very very specific. They get very schematic and expansive in their theologizing of the relationship of the Atman with Bhagavan. Okay, you get a lot of very enormous amount of devotional literature emerges in the 16th century. So in those traditions, they say there's three kinds of bhakti. They say there's karma mishrita, mixed with desires for material things.
Right.
I'll explain them in a minute.
Yeah.
Jnana mishrita, mixed with a desire for liberation. And there's shuddha bhakti, pure bhakti, which is not asking God for anything.
Right.
Now, the karma mishrita bhakti is pretty much what all of our world theisms are. You go to a church, you go to a mosque, and it's gimme, 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 material things, right? Solve my problem, dear God, I got this problem. It's basically a long list of gimme, gimme, gimme. So that is bhakti, because your bhakti means the relationship with the bhakta and Bhagavan. So this is some kind of a relationship, right? The bhakta is approaching Bhagavan with bhakti, with prayers and pujas and what have you. That's bhakti, the verbal noun. So the subject is the bhakta and the object is Bhagavan. So the bhakta is doing bhakti to Bhagavan, but for with a shopping list of material needs. So that's the first type. Karma, we know what that means. Sort of fruitive, karma means attachment to the fruits, not karma yoga, just karma. And it's mishrita, it's mixed. The second category is Patanjali, which is you approach Ishvara, not for mundane things. You've understood that will never make me happy. You've understood, samsara is suffering. You've understood I'm not this body. You've really, you've made some serious progress on the spiritual path, and you realize I'm an Atman, and you realize the goal of life is to realize the Atman, have a Svarupa Vastanam experience, as Patanjali would frame it, but you want God to bestow it to you. So that's Patanjali, Ishvara Pranidhana, Samadhi Siddh here. So that's called Jnana Mishrita. It's still not love of God. There's no love. Still a kind of gimme, 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 but it's a high level gimme, gimme. You're not asking for mundane bits of, plastic, made in Hong Kong, right? You're asking for, a wonderful goal. You realize experience of your own real nature. Then they contrast both of those with Shuddha Bhakti, where you know you're an Atman, of course you know that, but you're approaching God not even asking for moksha. You want to have an eternal relationship with God. You want to have love of God. You've read the stories of the great bhaktas. You've got this information about just the ecstasy of bhakti itself, not asking God for anything. It's pure. you're approaching, we could actually read a verse from the Gita where Krishna says there's 4 kinds of people that approach me: the needy, those desiring wealth, those desiring moksha, and then he says, and the wise. And he says the wise are not asking anything. They just know there is a God, and therefore I want to know that God. I don't even want moksha. And he says,
kind of seems obvious once you know there's a God. Yeah.
And he says all 4 of them are special. That they're all bhaktas in their own way, but the wise is dear to me, and I am dear to the wise. So clearly he's favoring. But Adam, imagine you had 3 friends. You thought they were, and one of them, the only time you ever see him is asking you for a tenner. It's like, oh yeah, have you got a tenner? Yeah, here's a tenner. Next, they never hear from him. No, nothing. Email, nothing. A week later, oh Adam, I've got another tenner, right? And that just goes on. And you might be a generous, kind person, and you can give him a tenner, but he's not going to capture your heart. And then a second friend, he only comes, you appreciate him a bit more, but he always wants knowledge. He wants information. He wants, it's not crass like a 10 quid bill, but still, he only really, he wants you to give him, whatever, guidance on whatever. And then a third friend who never asks for anything, just adores you, thinks you're just awesome, and just wants to be in your company. Now, who's going to steal your heart? And if good. Bhagavan, if Ishvara versa is a being, then the same applies, we could say.
So is it correct to say that Samkhya is kind of, people say it's atheistic as a system?
Well, there were multiple schools of Sankhya.
Right.
Most of them are theistic, like the Gita is Sankhya. Right, the Gita talks of the gunas, it talks of Purusha Prakriti, it talks about the earth, water, fire, air.
So I suppose maybe we should back up and say, well, what is Samkhya then?
Because people, the metaphysics,
right?
Which starts off with 3 gunas, then interact, and then the creation emanates forth, and it starts off with buddhi, and then ahankara, and then manas. You got and then the karmendriyas, the gyanendriyas. The working organs, the sense acquiring, the knowledge acquiring senses, then you've got the qualities, and then you've got the 5 substances. So that metaphysical schema is Sankhya. Now, some Sankhya put a Bhagavan beyond all that, from which, and that is the Bhagavad Gita, is theistic Sankhya. Mahabharata, theistic Sankhya. All the Puranas, theistic Sankhya. So the vast majority of Sankhya traditions, including the Shakta traditions, the Shaiva ones, are Sankhya metaphysics. But there wasn't a non-theistic branch. We know that because Vedanta, in the 2nd chapter and the 1st chapter of the Vedanta Sutras, critiques the non-theistic Sankhya. So there was definitely a non-theistic Sankhya, but I think it's overstated when people say Sankhya writ large, the entire Sankhya. Massively overstated. There were non-theistic Sankhya traditions, maybe the Sankhya Karika. Certainly Gautama's commentary is explicitly atheistic, but that's a minority within. So, and yoga is another example of a theistic Sankhya. The Yoga Sutra.
That's what I was going to say. How would you then differentiate yoga as a school as a darshana to Samkhya?
You wouldn't differentiate it in the early period. It only gets differentiated much later.
Right.
So even when you see the first commentary on the Yoga Sutra, let's say Vyasa, in the 3rd century, he doesn't think of yoga as a separate school. That comes centuries later. Whenever he finishes commentary, he writes at the end of each of the 4 padas, he says, thus ends pada 1 of the Vyasa Bhasha on Sankhya. He thinks he's writing a commentary on Sankhya, the first commentary. Yes.
Yeah.
There was no difference. It wasn't a separate school back then. But sometime, maybe a few hundred years ago, maybe around the middle of the Common Era, the idea of the 6 schools of philosophy emerges. We don't quite know where that first emerges yet, but it's
that
not
recently.
It's not old like the Upanishads or anything like that. No, it's not as old as the Yoga Sutras. In the Yoga Sutras, Yoga Sutras is a Sankhya text.
And what did they think they were doing distinct from others in the Yoga Sutras?
Well, they saw them. The Yoga Sutra, the only opponent that's taken that's actually engaged in the Yoga Sutras is a Vijnana Buddhism, mind-only school. Yeah.
Right.
That's the only, and that's quite a few verses in chapter 4. So that must have been quite prominent at that time. Yeah. But
what about
talk about Ishvara, Adam?
Yeah. I just wanted to say
ending up in mind only.
Okay. Carry on talking about Ishvara. I would maybe say, like,
you want, mate.
Don't you think that there's some clear kind of Buddhist aspects to the Yoga Sutras when it starts talking about Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, right? Like generating good states to combat negative emotions. It's kind of, has it absorbed Buddhism? Is there a Buddhist interpolation there?
Some people try to argue that. I don't. That's not my.
You don't think so? I know you don't think so. I was just.
I think there are common.
Baiting you there.
There's a common pool of terms.
Right.
Back in the ancient period. And these terms like Karuna, Maitri, and all of them, Ahimsa, the Yamas, the Niyamas, these terms, Dharana, Buddhism has 7 different kinds of Dharana. There's a pool of terms, Kaivalya, and so forth. And different yogis, and remember, there's no pope, there's no systematic kind of, there's no systematizing system.
Yeah.
There's charismatic yogis in the forests of ancient India, right? No one sort of in the sutras is the first time that actually we see this attempt to kind of organize and schematize and pull things together into distinct subject matters.
Yeah.
And Patanjali does it for yoga. So there's a pool of terms. And then in time, certain terms start to become associated with emerging traditions and the other schools stop using them.
Right.
So another example of that is nirvana, which in the Gita is used twice. I think it's very unsound scholarship to say, therefore, the Gita was influenced by Buddhism. No, it was a common term. And you see it in the Mahabharata. You can't say that, you see it in these different texts. And eventually then it becomes associated with Buddhism and everybody else stops using it. So likewise with these terms,
interesting.
Maitri, they're just common terms. They just mean kindness and compassion. Why, I wouldn't associate them with any school until a much later stage. So I think, what tends to be, I think, a fallacy is that some scholars, and they should know better, if they see a term emerge first in one text and then emerge later in a text, let's say 50 or 100 years later, then they assume the second text has borrowed it from the first text. That might be one way of thinking about it, but another is these are just common terms. It just happens to surface first in the literary record in one text, and it just happens to surface 100 years later in some other school's text, but it doesn't necessarily point to borrowing.
And what's the role of ethics in the first place? I mean, just simply, again, coldly speaking, for the understanding of the self. There's no objective system governed by a god that gives a right or a wrong for Patanjali. It's simply, you need to act in this way because otherwise you're going to get involved in karma, in furthering your karma.
Well, the karma is an overarching system. And so we have verses 2, chapter 2, 13, 14, 15, 16, that your jati, desha, your birth, where you're born, is either hlada paritapa, is either distressful or pleasant. Your jati, your birth, your ayu, your lifespan, and your jati ayu bhoga, and your quality of life is either hlada or paritapa, based on your punya or apunya, based on whether you've been pious or impious. Now that's a universal overarching rule. Now Patanjali doesn't say it was created by God, but the other traditions do. The other theistic traditions, like the Gita, Krishna says, Devi hi yasha guna mayi mama maya. This is my maya. This is my shakti. These are my rules. So the Gita is much more theistically, informational. It gives much more information about karma and maya. Patanjali just refers to it because he would assume everybody knows what it is when he's writing. All traditions accept karma. That's accepted by everybody. Buddhists, Jains, Hindus, everyone accepts karma, reincarnation. These are, you don't
pretty much.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a pretty nihilistic view of things we have. If you don't have karma, you're kind of fucked, really, aren't you?
Actually, there were some teachers that rejected karma, including, and we don't really know about them, but the Buddha mentions what he calls in the Buddhist text, according to the Buddha, the Dhamma texts, he mentions 6 heretical teachers that did not accept karma. So it's not like when I say everybody, I don't mean every single body. Yeah.
But then when you really, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a sidebar, but then if you don't have cause and effect, you really got no way out. I mean, what are you going to do? You're trapped, aren't you?
Well, some of those would say there is no you. They might be materialists and say there is no you that is trapped. There's only that conglomeration. I mean, there were materialists back in ancient India. Just today, that might be a more majority position, but they existed back then as well. Because wherever you have thinking people, you're going to have a gamut of views.
Yeah.
So you're going to have materialists. I mean, some of the most brilliant intellectuals in even our Western intellectual history were materialists. So there's always going to be that, unless there's some imposing power like a Catholic Church, which forbids it, and then it becomes heretical, and then you get whatever you become heretical, you get hereticized, and you get and then you develop a reputation, the stigma associated with it, and so forth. There's always going to be materialists as long as there are thinking people, and there's always going to be theists, and there's always going to be monists, and there's always going to be those that accept a soul but don't accept God. And you're going to have the whole gamut, and you do in the West. It's just in the West you had 1,500 years of church hegemony that stifled a lot of critical thinking. If that's lifted, look what happens. Now we have all these different.
Why didn't we see it? I mean, that's the thing, I think, which it makes the Indian perspective so relevant now. There wasn't a stifling factor, right? Like there was oral traditions that were kept alive, and you have a direct access to a method, right? Which I think was there in Christianity, but it's been lost through systemization of religion too much. Well, why was that? That the geography just simply kind of like political geographic?
There's no way you can answer that question. But what you do have is a kind of a Vedic straitjacket. You do have a caste system.
Yeah, right.
You have a different kind of straitjacketing where you do have the Vedic texts, even though nobody follows them. In other words, the later traditions have very, very slim and tenuous relationship with the old Vedas. I mean, you look at Shakta traditions or Krishna Bhakti. Where's any of that in the Vedas? Or even in the Upanishads. So you have this nominal allegiance to the Vedas, but what you do have is a kind of a Brahminical straitjacketing, so that Brahmin caste monopolize the control of the rituals, as well as the Sanskrit only the Brahmins kind of really have access to, and the dissemination of knowledge. That gets kicked aside by bhakti on a massive scale. But so you do have that. But why was there not a pope? I guess if, let's say Christ, let's take the story at face value. And Christ gave, the keys to the kingdom of God to Peter, and then Peter then gives it to the next pope like that. Well, imagine Christ was one of many characters. Imagine John the Baptist, survived, imagine, and they all started their own lineages, right? And they all had their own flavors, and that's more what then perhaps the West would have looked more like India. But somehow or other, that one Christ figure somehow or other became.
I should dominate the market.
The closest to that was the Buddha, but he did that for a while in parts of India. I mean, Buddhism was dominant for a few centuries, but then it's just, scholars speculate about why. But
interesting.
And it went east, so forth, and but that, I suppose, that could have happened in India if Buddhism had sort of dominated. I don't know, but it didn't. So now why?
Yeah.
You want my speculation?
Of course. Well, I said geographical influences. That like it's not as easy to travel, right? So stuff gets stuck, kept distinct.
Well, but why wouldn't it be easy to travel in India? Why would it be any less easy than in the West?
But I think Europe's a little bit more clement climate, isn't it? It's like mountainous and, just smaller spaces and,
yeah, but if you take Europe as one landmass,
yeah.
Remember those kingdoms are always shifting anyway.
Yeah.
You've got mountains, you've got what India's got mountain, it's got the north, it's got the plains, it's got maybe we'll never know, Adam, but
it's not that great. Yeah, as a theory. What's yours?
I would say that there were intense practitioners who, rather than, who really sort of, went to the forests and engaged in intense practices, as the Buddha did. He's actually exactly what he did. He was an extreme meditator. And that's why he came to the middle path, because he went from one extreme to the other. Hedonistic, like life of the prince, to the extreme hedonism, and had his enlightenment experience, his own personal enlightenment experience, right? Not really based on any text. He wasn't following even a guru figure. He wasn't following any, guide, any scriptural instructions. So there's a lot of that. And therefore, they all are charismatic. You have a lot of charismatic individuals. Some are having visions of Shiva. Some are having visions of Krishna, and that's real. They have a vision of their own Atman, and they have a vision of a distinct Ishvara, Atman, in a form such as Krishna or Vishnu. Some others are just having visions of their own Atman. The Buddha is having his own, experience. We don't really know what that is, but we know how it gets theorized centuries later. So when you have all of these rugged individualists, yogis, right? All powerful, all with their collections of disciples. Most of them don't found lineages, but some of them do. So you're not going to have just one person emerge from the pack and lay claim to supreme absolute authority over the world, which is basically how Christians see Christ, right? And
also, it's to do with isn't it to do with the oral tradition versus the written tradition as well? That for some reason stuff didn't get written down so much in India. Or also maybe to do with the climate, that stuff, that it would just wouldn't preserve.
But what you didn't need that in India. You had these nowhere in the rest of the world is there anything that parallels the memorizing techniques that were developed in a very, very early period, right from the Rig Veda. When the British scholars went and they were collecting, they wanted to reconstruct the original Rig Veda, right? And because they were interested in the Indo-European issue, what was the origin of even the Vedas, right? Was it Germany, right? The whole Aryan thing, right? The quest for the Aryan.
Yeah.
They got the Rig Veda from Kashmir, from Bengal, from South India, that had been separated for millennia. And they were almost identical. Nothing like parallels that. And how so? Because of these strategies and techniques of what they call mnemonic ways of memorizing, where you did 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. So agne me ne ag, agne me ne ag. Then the next one, agne me he. So ne me he me ne. So they would take the word and they would first syllable, second, third, then backwards, and then we do 2, 3, 4, then 3, 4, 5, and that was just one technique. There was probably a half, I don't know how many, but at least a half a dozen. And in this way, even if you didn't have a clue what you were chanting, and got to the point where people didn't understand the hymns anymore, nothing could fall out because it would leave a gap in the sequence.
Yeah.
That kind of memorizing, preservation, because the Vedas was all about the power of the sound, the sacrifice, efficacy of the Vedic sacrifice was about pronouncing and chanting those mantras completely correctly. If there was one syllable wrong, the whole sacrifice failed. When you have that kind of pressure, if you want to perform a ritual, if you have, if you go, instead of going agne me, you go agne me, finished. You have to start all over again.
It's like 10 days wasted.
10 days wasted.
But what about, I've distracted you badly, but bringing it back to the sutras a little bit. What about this Om then? Just one mention in one sutra in terms of, what's the relevance of just bringing it in once?
But just to finish up that last point. So because of this memorizing techniques, the traditions were preserved. They were also preserved in writing, but even those manuscripts didn't survive, we don't think we have anything more than a few centuries old. But because of these memorizing techniques, the information, the lineages, were handed down very precisely and reliably. So I just wanted to finish that up.
Yeah.
Right, because you were saying, well, why is it that you were saying why is there so much variety? I think could it be that there wasn't a literary tradition to codify things? And
also there's another point, bar my last idea. Why was the sutras written down in the first place? Why were the sutras written down in the first place? I mean, and also as a kind of glossary of all different teachings. I mean, is there any significance in that, in the fact that they were written down?
Well, they were transcribed. I mean, they would be memorized, but they were still transcribed, so that the scribes would write things down. I don't know when that, then that's all tied in with the beginning of language, and I think there's evidence of language going back to 3rd century BCE. In other words, written. So you
see it as one sort of synchronistic teaching rather than a hegemony of different points of view, all kind of grouped under, okay, here's what's happened so far. All these different, it's just one person. This is Samkhya and the way it's evolved up to this point.
You mean the Yoga Sutras? Yeah, I see that what Patanjali is doing is a systematizer. There's all these other traditions out there. You mentioned Karuna, Maitri. There's these buzzwords, yamas and niyamas, right? And so we have reference to 6 limbs of yoga, and if you look at the earliest texts and the Upanishads and then the Mahabharata, so you have all of these different, because there's no pope figure, you just have these charismatic teachers, just like we have in asana today. We have the choice method, we have Iyengar. So Patanjali says, okay, there comes this point, the way I see it, when the intellectuals sort of feel this need to preserve and codify the ancient traditions. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is the idea that the Kali Yuga is things are going to get lost, people will cheat, people are no longer reliable. So there's that impulse of the Kali Yuga, right? People can't remember anymore, memories are weak. So we need the, writing's the prop. There's that, and I think also the threat of Buddhism, which is, we don't know about very, very early Buddhism. The Buddha never explicitly rejects the Atman, but certainly later Buddhists reject the Atman. That's a major threat for the Vedanta, Sankhya, yoga traditions. So then you get this urge, this impulse, then the sutras emerge. And then you get very systematic, each sutra dedicated to a particular topic. Then you get this sort of systematic preservation and systematizing of pre-existing information. So tying that into what you said, yes, there would have been all these previous strands in the forests of ancient India, maybe parchments here or there, different things being memorized, handed down. And Patanjali says, okay, lads, let's get this together. Let's organize this. We got some threats going on here. Kali Yuga's advancing. It's going to get lost. These Buddhists are running around saying there's no Atman. Okay, yeah, let's get organized here and preserve the old Vedanta teachings. And this is what I'm going to do. Badarayana is going to write the Vedanta Sutra. I'm not saying they knew each other. I'm just being rhetorical here. Mimamsas, they're going to codify the rituals. Sankhya is going to do its metaphysics thing. Nyaya is going to work on logic and and each of the sutras then eventually coming from older traditions. Each of the sutras then codifies, systematizes, codifies the older traditions, and from that point on, these sutras become canonical texts for the intellectual side of Hinduism. Not the intellectual side. The sutras are for intellectuals. They're not meant for everybody. They're meant for Brahmins, male Brahmins who know Sanskrit, preserve the teaching. Now it's preserved. Now they can get handed down, and then somehow. But most people in ancient India, and even today, the real yogis, the Shaivas, the dreadlocks, they're covered in scary looking, right? The tridents. they're all illiterate.
Yeah.
They're illiterate. They get their information from their gurus.
Yeah.
Maybe one of them can read, maybe,
Yeah.
but they're all illiterate. So they're all still receiving it through word and mouth.
Yeah. But the sutras is a orthodox text, right? It's within the. But
then it becomes one. It eventually becomes like the sixth. But that's fairly recent that it be the sixth of Indian philosophy. Because where are all the other schools? What about Jim Malin? What about all the Shaktas traditions? What about the Shaivas? What about the Kundalini traditions? Why don't they make it into this hallowed list of six? Yeah, so that's a complete artificiality. 6 schools of Indian philosophy. Somehow or other, some Brahmin.
Well, it's neat, isn't it? It's a kind of Western idea of, let's get everything in a little box and make it nice and neat so we can all understand it, and then we can look smart, kind of regurgitating, there's 6 darshanas, or if we don't do any if we don't actually practice, and what about the Om then? Just to finish it up, Edwin, I know you're busy. The Om and was it Tasya Vachaka? This one time, this one mention of Om, and it's the word, and it is Ishvara.
Yes. So that goes back to the old Upanishads where Om is Brahman. So you then have this relationship between Brahman and Ishvara. So Krishna in the Gita, for example, will say, I am Brahman, I am the Brahmanohi Pratishtaham, I'm the foundation of Brahman, and I'm Ishvara. So you have this conflation of Brahman and Ishvara. And whether it's in the Upanishads or Patanjali, this Brahman / Ishvara being, depending on the different schools, they'll understand that relationship differently. We don't want to get into that today, but we can talk about that another time, the relationship between, non-dual Advaita Vedanta, and maybe we should have a session on Advaita Vedanta and the dualist Vedantas another time. But for now, that being manifests as not as Om, and Om is not a sound representation of Ishvara. No, it is Ishvara in sonic form.
Right. Yeah.
It's really important to understand that. It's like a Catholic. Well, were you born a Catholic?
Not really.
No.
Completely out of the fold. Yeah. Well, actually, my mother's a Catholic, but I wasn't confirmed.
You've heard of transubstantiation, right?
Yes, transubstantiation. Yes, you take the wafer and it is the body. Yeah,
is the body. It doesn't represent the body. It's not.
It is the body. It is the body.
That's not a bad way. That's not a bad in for Western minds to think about Om. It is Ishvara in sonic form, and it's grace. Right. It's grace that Brahman can, because otherwise, how do you fix the mind on Ishvara? Well, do you fix the mind on the idea of Ishvara? Right? The mind can only fix on things grosser than itself. The mind is prakritic. Ishvara is non-prakritic. So the prakritic thing cannot grasp a non-prakritic thing.
So what's Patanjali doing then? Like saying because it's formless, isn't it? I mean, he's not giving any qualities.
We know that. We don't know that. He doesn't talk about form.
Right.
Let's be clear.
So it could be.
Oh yeah. Many of the Ishvara traditions, Ishvara has form.
Right. So when he's saying it's a lot of shorthand, he's saying it's but it could mean.
He's not going there. He's not going into that whole thing of form.
Right.
Yeah. Right. He's just saying, and everybody agrees, whether you're a Dvaita or Vishishta Dvaita or a Dvaita or a Shakta, everyone agrees that somehow or other Om in some form or fashion is the ultimate being. Now they're all going to theologize it differently. So therefore, Patanjali is just saying something non-controversial, universally accepted, and you fix the mind on that Om, because you have to chitta vritti nirodha on something.
Yeah.
And then you attain the goal of yoga, which is Sarupe Vastana, right? You chitta vritti nirodha on Om. And because it's Om and Ishvara, he can also remember, you quoted that verse, that Om who is Ishvara, Samadhi Siddhir, Ishvara Pranidhana. You pranidhana your mind. How do you pranidhana your mind to Ishvara? By fixing it on Om, that you're now pranidhanaing your mind on Ishvara as Om. And if you do that, then Ishvara can bestow Samadhi. And then you have a Swarupa Vastanam experience, an experience of pure consciousness. But you know what the cool thing about Patanjali is? And then he goes on to say, well, all right, you don't like Ishvara. And he gives a list of 5 other things, all this. And then at the end of the list, he says,
anything you want, any heritage you want. Yeah.
I think that's so cool because he's just so non-dogmatic. No,
Quite pragmatic, isn't he? Yeah, yeah.
But notice how he's put Ishvara on the first on the list, which is important in Indian exposition. Important things go first.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And it gives 5 or 6 verses. The other ones only get one very short. Or this, or this, or this, or this. You know, the prana, or the someone vitaraga, without desire. But he goes on a bit about Ishvara, that he's supremely omniscient. He's not like a yogi who can become omniscient. In chapter 3, the Siddhi, you can become omniscient, but Ishvara's not like that. Because tatra niratishayam, his sarvajna, his omniscience is niratishayam, not like some yogi. He's supremely, unsurpassed. And he's the guru of the ancients, because he's not affected by time. So he's not someone that's made it out of Prakriti, like Eliade tried to say.
Yeah. But then in the first line of the second Sadhana Pada, he says tapas the most important. Then if we're going with the most important first, right, idea, tapas is the most important. Svadhyaya, Isvana Pranidhana, only finally Kriya Yoga.
It's true. But actually, first statements, this is a Vedanta principle. They give 6 principles for interpreting. And one is opening statements, and one is actually concluding statements.
Right.
So you could look at it that tapas is necessary just to kickstart your and I agree.
Right. You've got to have some kind of effort, haven't you?
I agree with Jim Mallinson. If that's his position, that asceticism is non-negotiable. Tapas is, and vairagya is not. They are non-negotiable. These are ascetic with a C, ascetic, not as not with
not as it's a close call. Yeah.
These are ascetic traditions, Adam.
And he also makes a very clear point on brahmacharya, right? I mean, it's not, this is not a lay text. It's it's clearly a.
And it's interesting how people try to wriggle out of what brahmacharya means.
Of course, yeah.
And it's interesting how they try to wriggle out what Ishvara means. Ishvara in the 3rd century means Vishnu, Shiva, and Krishna. I've given so many lectures on this. Most recently, LMU. We can't take the word Ishvara out of its context. Patanjali is assuming we know what Ishvara means. And Ishvara, by that time, going already in the late Upanishads, Ishvara means, Shiva. It means Krishna. It means Vishnu. It means a personal being with qualities and form and who manifests in the world. And it's so interesting to see how people try to, whitewash and sterilize that because, for a Western, consumer market.
It's just not popular these days, is it? Talk of God, right? Kind of people feel, oh God, we've been there, we got fooled once, we're not going to be fooled again.
It's true. But people, remember, are running away from the Abrahamic God as represented in kind of institutionalized Christianity. So really, what are they running away? Is it really God? Some are, yeah. But some are running away from institutionalized religion.
Yes, more than, yeah. It's the use of God to basically blackmail you, right? Any parting shots on Ishvara, or should we leave it there?
No, other than to say, we can't take the Ishvara and the things that Patanjali says. Omniscient, he's the guru of the ancients, he's never affected by karma. We cannot take that out of what the word Ishvara means at that time that the sutras were written. And the entire subcontinent, Ishvara meant one of the forms of Bhagavan, such as Krishna and Shiva and Vishnu. So that would be, whether we like it or not, whether we want to.
But why didn't he go on about it more then?
I think he's just being. I think he just doesn't want to alienate it. If
he's a really, really nice guy.
I think he's a really cool guy. I mean, that's just me. Yeah. I want to think that about him. I think he doesn't want to. If he comes out like Krishna in the Gita says, "I'm God, I'm God, I'm God." Well, what if you're a Shaivite then? Then you're going to have to say, yes, Krishna's God, but he's an extension of Shiva. You're going to have to sort of like work a little bit at that. I just think Patanjali doesn't want to get into that. I think the way I want to think about him, and I'm not saying this is what he's thinking at all. This is what I want. Is he wants you look whatever form of Ishvara captures your heart, go with that one, which is a very common position in bhakti. But there definitely a form. Ishvara has a form in all the Ishvara traditions. Ishvara is even in Nyaya, where they just argue, they don't bring in Shiva or anything like that. When they're being philosophers, they just, Ishvara is just an intelligent being, but in their private lives, they're all Shaivas. Ishvara is Shaiva. So what do I want to part with? Like it or not, Ishvara, in whether it's yoga, whether it's Vedanta, whether it's Advaita Vedanta, or dualist Vedanta, Ishvara means Vishnu, or it means Narayana, or it means Krishna.
Yeah. I think it's reading with context, isn't it? And people's kind of think, well, I can read it in however way I want. And it's actually in a certain context. So when you refer to that, that has a whole bunch of things associated with it, right?
Well, then you're going to get people like me who's going to come, you're going to interview people like me and say, well, look, if you're interested in what Ishvara means in the entire textual tradition of India across the centuries, it means Shiva, Vishnu, Krishna, and we're going to bang away at that, and people can take it or leave it.
Yeah, well, we're going to continue. We shall continue. All right, Edwin, we'll leave it there for today, and we'll join you again shortly.
Cheers,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.